Today, we are
Rudra sir, your audio sound something
about our
problem. There is some problem in audio.
people of our college. That's the start. I extend my this internet
You are
they
not
follow
audible,
our
sir, properly.
collaboration with develop candidate. Dr. Aditya Mukherjee from the New Delhi. Proud initiative policy dialogue. Now, in fact, to
Thank you, Rudra sir. Good afternoon, everybody. We are assembled here on this cyber platform to listen to our contemporary history, presented and desperate times because situation and privilege to have Mukherjee with us today. On behalf of the organizing team and the Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha, CAR, would be happy to announce he is one of the key advisor of this event and CARD too. He is the mentor, guide, and a great advisor of many gurus of this country. Our young director, Dr. Vikram Kesari Jana, is one of them. I take this opportunity to Professor Mukherjee is a Dayan in the Indian history and his wide-ranging and encompassing academic interventions over the last 4 to 5 decades have been truly inspiring and commendable. He is a former professor of contemporary Indian history at the Center for Historical Studies and the Dean School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is a face of world of academics and knowledge to establish authority on Indian contemporary illustrious academic career. He would like mentions just a few notable achievements and experience to give our audience an idea about the variety of scholarship that he has to his credit. He is the editor of the Sage series in modern Indian history published by Sage Publications, and 15 monographs have already been published in that series. He was editor of the selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru 2009 to 2011. He is a member of Indian Council for Historical Research ICHR since 2009. His specialization includes economic history, particularly business history and the political economy of a post-colonial development. He was president of the for Modern India 2007 to 2008. He has been a visiting. Thank everybody for giving me a patient hearing. Thank you again and again.
Breaking news. Also the editor of Sage series in Modern Indian History and a member of ICHR since 2009. He specializes in economic history, particularly business history and the political economy of post-colonial development. Besides all these, he has been visiting professor and visiting fellow at a number of various other foreign universities too. He has authored and co-authored a number of books which are featured in Indian syllabus, some of which are India's struggle for independence, India since independence, imperialism, nationalism, and the making of Indian capitalist class, 1927 to 47, and lots others. Particularly talking about his viewpoint, he is a keen supporter of a vision of an open, democratic, secular, and civil libertarian state, which was to promote a modern scientific outlook in civil society in independent India. This was also the aim behind our Indian national movement. And according to him, there is one method of social mobility, that is education. Education with a vision of scientific temper. Sir, thanks a lot for connecting with us. Now, after this brief introduction of him, I would like to invite Professor Aditya Mukherjee to please initiate this talk. Over to Mukherjee, sir.
Thank you very much, Payal. Thank you, Professor Sharat Chandra Pradhan, Principal, Professor Rudranarayan Das, Professor Subham Das, and my friend Bikram Jaina, whom I have known for many years now, since he was a young student, for this opportunity to speak to my friends in Odisha. I have had a very long association with this state. My mother grew up in Balasore, and I have had for decades, for the last 40 years, students and colleagues from Odisha. Many of them have become very close friends. I've had many occasions to visit. In fact, I never miss a visit to this unbelievably beautiful part of our country. But unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we have to make do with this interaction online. But nevertheless, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak to my friends in Odisha. Originally, the subject given to me was challenges to the social sciences today. But then I thought over it, and I thought that what is more relevant for us today is to discuss the challenges to the social sciences for us. That is, for underdeveloped countries like us, as Professor Pradhan said, the third world countries, which is also called the Global South. So I'm going to look at the specific challenges that we as a people face in the social sciences today. The chief challenge that is faced today is that, believe it or not, of Eurocentrism. The reason why I'm saying believe it or not is because Europe no longer is the dominant part of the world. I'll come to that theme in a minute. But the fact is that when the modern disciplines of the social sciences, with which we try to understand society, when they developed in the 19th and early 20th centuries, 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, the disciplines of history, of political science, of psychology, of economics, when they emerged, was when Europe dominated the world. They had colonized large parts of the world. They had what may be called, they held ideological hegemony over the world. In other words, these disciplines, when they were born, they carried, to use a phrase from psychology, they carried the imprint of a European point of view. And this, unfortunately, has remained till today, when Europe is no longer the dominant power in the world. a very erudite philosopher called Enrique Dussel from Argentina once described Europe in the following manner. He said, if you drew a line of the progress of human civilization from, let's say, year 0 to today, a long period, the whole evolution of human civilization over thousands of years, if you drew that line, it obviously has progressed, has gone up with ups and downs, but it has resolved itself into a linear upward direction. In this whole line of progress, human progress, he says, European dominance was a tiny little blip. That is, Europe was not dominant in the ancient world. There were several other civilizations from Egypt to India to Mesopotamia, to just name it, which were more advanced or equally advanced than any part of Europe. Europe did not dominate the world till as late as the 18th century. In the 18th century, just to remind you, India and China produced 2/3 of the world's GDP, about 2.5 times the GDP of the whole of West Europe put together. At the beginning of the 18th century, India produced, again, please let that figure sink into your heads, India produced 8 times the GDP of the United Kingdom, just 18th century. So obviously Europe did not dominate historically everywhere. It did not. India and China did, till as late as the 18th century. Europe does not dominate in the 20th century, it's the American century. Europe does not dominate today, it is the Asian century. But yet, the Eurocentric point of view has not yet disappeared. There is a time lag between the decline of Europe as an economic power and the decline of the ideological hegemony of the European point of view. Just as there is a time lag between the arrival of the Asian economies into the global economic high table and the third world or Asian economies who are now becoming powerful economies like China, like to some extent India and Japan and South Korea, and so many parts of the third world are not dynamic economies, but yet they have reached nowhere near the intellectual high table. When you talk of a school of thought, even today, which this civilization of ours, 5,000-year-old civilization, some would put it even longer, which school of thought dominates the world today from India? There is no school. If you're talking of history, you talk of Cambridge School. If you're talking of economics, you're talking of Chicago School. If you're talking of Marxism, you're talking of Frankfurt School. Where is the school of thought in the third world? So it's an indication of the fact that simply acquiring economic development is not equal to you're also acquiring an independent spine and an independent mind. We still do Shashtang Pranam when we see a white skin or a possibility of a fellowship somewhere in the West. So it is this colonial mindset which has come to stay for a long time, and therefore Eurocentrism still dominates. And therefore I said one of the chief challenges to the social sciences today is Eurocentrism. This means that we look upon our own history, our own ancient history, medieval history, modern history. We look upon various aspects of our lives. That is what constitutes modernity, what constitutes development, what constitutes justice, what is scientific achievement, what is a secular tradition, what is a nation, what is ethics, or what is aesthetics, is still not determined by us. We still follow the lead from somewhere in the West. Now, this is not surprising. I'll give you a glaring example of how powerful Eurocentrism is. And it's a small anecdote. when I was first asked to speak on this subject, it was on a major congress which involved about 17 universities in France. And in that congress, they asked me to give this keynote speech on the crisis of the social sciences. That is, what are the challenges of the social sciences? I accepted it, and then I regretted it because I said, my God, this is too big a theme. But then to get started, I said, if I'm going to see what are the challenges to the social sciences, let me read a person who I think is the greatest social scientist and see, are there any challenges? And as luck would have it, in my opinion, I thought, as a historian and particularly an economic historian, the scholar that I've looked up to as a great scholar was a British Marxist scholar called Eric Hobsbawm. All of you have know about him. He's written so many books, particularly this series called The Age of Revolution, The Age of Capital, The Age of Empire. And the last in the series was, in this particular series, was The Age of Extremes, The Short 20th Century. So I picked up this last volume of the series and I said, let me see, can I find a clue to what are the challenges to the social sciences today? And what do I find in the very first few pages? Hobsbawm quite correctly does not divide historical time into 100-year sets. It's not as if that 18th century is one thing, 19th is another, and 20th is another. So therefore, he created the term of the long 19th century. That is, the 19th century phenomenon, he says, continues up to the First World War. And then he created the concept of the short 20th century, that the 20th century phenomenon lasted really from 1914, the First World War, till about the 1980s and 90s, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the 21st century phenomenon really begins in the last quarter of the 20th century. Now, this is how he has divided the period. And you may agree or disagree. I think there is a lot of percentage in this division, but that is not the point I'm raising. He then goes on to characterize these periods. And he says, and I'm quoting him, he says, the long 19th century was a period of almost unbroken material, intellectual, and moral progress. That is to say, improvement in the conditions of civilized life. He's going into ecstasy about the 19th century. It's a period when material progress, moral progress, art, literature, science, everything just flowers. All right. And then he says the short 20th century begins in the interwar period with what he calls, that is from 14 to 45, as a period of catastrophe, disaster. So it is the disastrous period, the first part of the 20th century. And then he says there is a golden period from about the 50s to the 80s. And then again, there is a catastrophe, 80s onwards. So as I was reading this, I thought that if you are not based in London, but happen to be based in Kolkata or Bhubaneswar or Beijing, this would seem absurd. I just gave you the statistics. For us, the 18th century was the great century. When India, I told you, produced 8 times the GDP of UK. When India and China produced 2.5 times the GDP of all the European countries put together. The 19th century, which Hobsbawm calls the great century, is the century when we were brought to our knees. Our noses were rubbed on the ground. Our economy shattered. Our culture, our history, our medicine, our literature, our art, everything was demonized. We were pushed back. That has been called a great century. And then in the 20th century, the very period, 1914 to 45, the period when the third world countries were able to take advantage of imperialism in crisis because of the wars and the Great Depression to surge ahead. This was shown for Latin America by Andre Gunder Frank, for India by Bipin Chandra, and by others for Indonesia and other countries, that the third world countries actually benefited in this period of crisis of imperialism, what has been called the loosening of the links theory. As the imperial stranglehold loosened, the third world countries got a spurge for some impetus forward. Now that he calls a catastrophe. What is the catastrophe for Europe is seen to be the catastrophe for the whole world. And then again, the last part of the 20th century, when India and China and many other third world countries again begin to scratch their way back into the economic high table of the world. From being smothered, they are now again coming up. That is the period he calls a catastrophe. So the Asian century is a catastrophe. Now this, as I said, is Eurocentrism, not from somebody who's colonial. Hobsbawm was a Marxist, an anti-imperialist, a great lover of India. But this comes out of where you situate yourselves, among which people. So it is very important to remember that for all of us, not to say that I cannot be Eurocentrist because I am so highly educated. We have to all look deep inside us to be able to see that do we carry a baggage which is not emerging from our people and our society and our needs, but a baggage which is emerging from somewhere else. That is the question that I wanted to raise. And that is why I gave you this example. The challenges to the Eurocentric worldview emerged in India during the period of the national movement itself. Before I talk of the challenges that were made to the Eurocentric worldview, okay, let me go ahead. Recognize that the challenges came not from academics. In the colonial period, academics could not survive. Education was part of the State Department. There was hardly any private education going on. And anybody who showed nationalist or anti-imperialist tendencies would be dismissed, lose their jobs. And there are many examples one can give of it happening to nationalist historians. So the first challenge came not from the academic sphere. The first challenge came from people who were in politics, that is, leaders of the national movement. The first challenge to the European understanding in economics, the whole business of imperialism leading to modernization, was first challenged by the early Indian nationalists. They were not professors. It's people like Dadabhai Naoroji, Rana Day, G.V. Joshi, and so on. They created the first challenge. And in fact, I can say it with confidence that they were the first in the world to create a comprehensive and sophisticated economic critique of imperialism, decades before Lenin, decades before Rosa Luxemburg. More or less the same ideas were in very detailed worked out and more or less simultaneously with Marx. Marx makes this break by the time he writes Capital in the 1860s. Before that, even there was confusion even in Marx's mind on what was to be what is the role of colonialism. But by the time Marx makes his break, the Indian nationalists have also made the break. Because very early Marx, in his very early writings, mainly journalistic writings, he had even thought of colonialism having a progressive and a destructive role. That is, by destroying the traditional order, the colonial system would create modernity, development, and all that. So the notion which was shared by the early Indian intelligentsia, people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, for example, who we call him the father of modern India. But Ram Mohan Roy talked of British rule as the gift of divine providence, Bhagwan ki deen hai. That is, because he saw, like Marx, that colonialism would lead us, it will lead to the destruction of the feudal order, the Raja Rani days, and will bring India into modernity, economic, political, and all that. That was the reason the educated Indian did not support the mutiny, because they saw the mutiny as a throwback. But this understanding is very rapidly demolished by the early Indian nationalists, people like Dadabhai Naroji, Ranade, etc. It was a brilliant breakthrough, as I said, which occurs simultaneously when Marx studies a colonial situation, he studies Ireland, he makes the same breakthrough. And they both come to the conclusion that the only way development and modernity can come to the third world, come to the colonies, is by overthrowing colonialism. So colonialism is not the route to modernity. Overthrow of colonialism is the route to modernity. So it is a big paradigmatic breakthrough in understanding of colonialism. And the Indian early nationalists led in this. But virtually nobody, including most Indians, recognize this fact. That is part of being a colonized mind. This is not because this has not been written about. There is a 700-page book by Professor Bipin Chandra called Rise and Growth of Economic Nationalism in India, which was written in the 1960s, and for it's now more than 70 years, and nobody has questioned the scholarship in that, which thoroughly establishes how the early Indian nationalists made a breakthrough, was one of the first in the world to make that breakthrough in understanding colonialism. But that whole breakthrough just does not appear in global social sciences. Now, this is what I mean by Eurocentrism, because it has not emerged from there. The challenge at the academic level could happen only after independence in a very big way. Once state power was not exercised to control academia, that is, there was freedom after independence, you saw a flourishing of the social sciences in India. Some of the best sociologists, historians, economists, just think of all the big names that you can know of, whether it is M.N. Srinivasan or Bipin Chandra or Irfan Habib or Ramila Thapar or R.S. Sharma or B.N. Ganguly. I'm just trying to name people across disciplines. Amartya Sen, Sukumai Chakravarti, they're producing their work in the 60s and 70s. So there is an effervescence, a reassertion anti-imperialist position that occurs in a big way. The Indian state also tries, again from the late 1960s, to intervene, to negate the influence of the communal and the colonial perspective on the social sciences. As you know, in the colonial period, any history textbook or political science textbook will start with the line, Angrezi Raj ki barkhatein, the benefits of British rule. So that kind of work had to go. And the communal understanding of Indian history, for example, dividing Indian history into religious periods, Hindu rule, Muslim rule, etc. These are all colonial understandings. Now they had to be questioned. And it was done from the 1960s onwards I would say, in a remarkably successful manner. One of the best historiographies, one of the best social sciences emerging out of the third world came from India in this period. However, 200 years of colonialism, from the early 19th century, at least from Macaulay's time, so easy to overthrow. And what we are witnessing in the recent years, particularly of the colonial point of view. I'll give you only 2 or 3 examples and then we'll move on. The best example, perhaps, is Professor Tirthankar Roy. He's a professor of economics, started off from Pune, which used to be a nationalist bastion at one time, and has landed quite predictably in the London School of Economics. And he wrote this book called the Oxford Economic History of India, which he said was a abridged edition of the Cambridge Economic History of India. This is his own words, in which he respected. I mean, I'm embarrassed to even repeat it. For example, he says in that book that during colonial rule, India grew rapidly. Industry, services, everything grew. Not only grew, it grew rapidly. That there was no deindustrialization. There was no forced commercialization. The Indian peasantry was not in any great poverty or debt. To the extent, he says, that the Indian peasant was in debt, it was a sign of his prosperity. That is, the Indian peasant was like the American peasant who's in debt because he's buying an aircraft to spray his fields. So what you were doing is rubbing salt on a dying, famine-ridden poor peasantry by saying that they are in debt because they are prosperous. And even that idea is not original. This is the title of Malcolm Darling, the governor of Punjab, his book, Punjab Peasants in Prosperity and Debt. So such is the rubbish with which this book is filled up. And it is taught as a textbook in large parts of India even today, even in Delhi University, which has one of the best undergraduate teaching in the country. Now that is what is the colonization of the mind in your own universities. Why? After all, it's printed, it's in English by Oxford University Press, and the scholar is situated, believe it or not, in London School of Economics. So how can what he's saying be wrong? Now that is a colonized mind. Everything that you have learned from Dadabhai Naoroji onwards, from Marx to Naoroji, till through Nehru to Amartya Sen to our greatest economists, is being questioned by the rubbish saying that colonialism led to development. And we have no difficulty in appropriating it. That's the worst form of Eurocentrism, a colonial mindset. The same kind of thing has gone on. You have others. I've just chosen on Tirthankar Roy because he's an academic, and it's my duty to question fellow academics. But there are others like Meghnad Desai, Lord Meghnad Desai, who used to be once a Marxist and then became a great admirer of Modi ji. And he's one of the Bhakt list. And he says that the globalization that occurred in the colonial period and the globalization that occurred in India in the neoliberal post-1991 phase were the good phases. And the bad phase, he says, was the Nehruvian period. He says the first 40 years of India's independence were wasted years. They were bad because he was trying to unstructure colonialism. So that period is bad. So what is good, according to him, is the colonial period and the neoliberal phase. But even this is argued stupidly because these two globalizations are not comparable at all. You can't conflate the two. The 18th, 19th century globalization for India was globalization under colonial hegemony. The opening up of India in the 1990s is not under a colonial state's hegemony. It's the independent Indian state which decides to open up after it has spent 40, 50 years to strengthen itself sufficiently to be able to open up. And it is not only India. No third world country opened up to the world immediately after independence. Even China opened up in 78. So whether it's Mao Zedong or Jawaharlal Nehru or Sukarno or Nasser, each one of them took their 30, 40, 50 years to first unstructure their colonial structure and build up sufficient capacity so that they are able to open up to the world. So these two globalizations are not comparable at all. But what you find is that those who were anti-imperialist, who tried to unstructure colonialism, are now called the demons. So it's not an accident that Jawaharlal Nehru has suddenly become a demon, not only to the BJP, which I can understand, because Jawaharlal Nehru was so strongly secular, but he's also a demon to the colonialists. So this marriage of colonialism and communalism, a theme which I'll keep coming back to today, is something very, very, very important. We must remember that the colonial perspective and the communal perspective emerge out of the same source, out of an alliance that they had throughout the entire colonial period. It may be quite another matter that the communalists today thump their chests about being nationalist. But let us not forget our own history and remember that right through the national movement, the communalists were the allies of the British, whether they be Muslim League or RSS or Hindu Mahasabha or whatever. So there was no nationalism involved there. They've suddenly become nationalist 70 years after the nation matter. I'll return to. So this resurgence of the colonial paradigm in India, it started in the 1960s itself. As I said, the anti-imperialist historiography, economics, sociology, politics emerged in the 60s. I gave you some names. Simultaneously, there was an attempt to reassert the colonial position. It was done by this American scholar called Morris de Morris. But the moment he wrote an article, it was smothered. Professor Tapan Ray Chaudhary, Professor Bipin Chandra, critique of Morris de Morris, and that shut him up for 20 years. And then again in the 1980s, you see, the first world doesn't give up so easily. In the 1980s came Economic History of India, and volume 2 of it, which covers the modern period, it repeats all the colonial arguments. No de-development, everything, this, that, and the other. No drain, and all that. So, and from then onwards, capping the 1980s effort, which was again critiqued by the top Indian economist historians, people like Amyo Kumar Bagchi or Irfan Habib, etc. Then comes our friend Roy, Tirthankar Roy. So it has continued. Tirthankar Roy is writing in 2006 and saying that colonialism was a good thing. So it's very recent. It is not. It is nothing. 2006 was his last book, but even as late as 2012, I read one article of his where he continues to maintain, despite our writing long pieces critiquing every line of what he has written, he continues to argue that. Because obviously in the West, there is a lot of back slapping for doing that. Now, alongside this resurgence of the colonial paradigm, what has happened is that nearly a century-long intellectual tradition of studying and critiquing the political economy of colonialism has been hijacked. It's been hijacked not only by the colonialists, but a motley stream occupied by postmodernists, post-colonial culture studies people, subaltern studies, etc. Now, this stream emanates very interestingly in the first world. Promoted by what Arif Darlik says, third world intellectuals who arrive in the first world academia. And they are shifting the focus away from the political economy of imperialism, and they have started critiquing the nation, critiquing nationalism, calling it an oppressive master narrative. This is a very favorite postmodernist language. Nationalism is an oppressive master narrative. And they started celebrating the fragment. So that uniting a country, forming a nation, which was such a difficult process that India began in the late 19th century, what the early nationalists, Suninath Banerjee, called India a nation in the making, a process of making a nation. That process got disrupted. And what happens is the academic elite in the third world now imitates their own elite, which has now settled in the first world. The subaltern school, for example, claims that they are the ones who are giving voice to the poor. They critique the nationalists, they critique the Marxists, saying these are all people who talk from above, they look upon the state, etc. They do not reflect the actual poor, the downtrodden. But they make one condition, that your study of the poor must be done from 10,000 miles away. So the entire subaltern school, leaving aside one or two, actually lives either in Australia or in England or in Canada or in USA. So from there, they are going to give voice to the people. So you can imagine how much voice the people are getting. The voice they are giving is denying our people, denying our nationalism to us, calling it a false narrative. That is not the best way, as I will show to you, to give voice to your own people. So what has happened is that the Indian intelligentsia, which is no longer associated with the movement. Remember the last point I made. The first challenge to the Eurocentric worldview came from Indian intelligentsia, which were part of the national movement. Movement, this anti-imperialist ideological framework. Today's intelligentsia, unfortunately, is not linked to any movement. The highly educated people are hardly in politics. Politics, as you know, is mainly in the hands of, rather unsavory characters. I mean, if you look at the list of the criminals who can stand for elections, you would be embarrassed to belong to this country. But that's the way it is. The elite, the educated in India, dreams of how to migrate abroad. I'll come to this theme in a moment because it is linked to what is happening to the social sciences in a moment. So what has happened is that the Indian intelligentsia is increasingly responding to the dominant ideologies in the West, to the paradigm that has been set by them, rather than create a paradigm where they ask their own questions. The postmodernist turn, as it is called, is destructive of the social sciences. It may be useful for literary criticism. That's where it emerged from, the postmodernist school. But it is destructive of the social sciences because it makes it very difficult to make any objective generalization. Because it says every voice has equal weight. It is my voice, it is his voice, it is third person's voice, you must give every voice the same weight. So the result is you cannot generalize, which means the status quo is empowered. So it is very much anti-development. But the most important thing that I want to point out is this debunking of the notion of the nation, which the postmodernists do. As I said, they call it the master narrative, which is destructive, it oppresses, etc., etc. Whereas the fact of the matter is that the third world, the best social scientists today, people like Immanuel Wallerstein, for example, has argued that the third world needs the idea of nation and nationalism in order to strike a bargain with the first world. It is a critical aspect of the third world moving from the periphery towards the semi-periphery, if not towards the center. But it is the notion of the nation itself which is critiqued in this school of thought, including among the subaltern school. Subaltern school not only critiques the notion of the nation, it makes fun of the greatest of our nationalist leaders, people like Gandhi, etc., calling him not only not anti-imperialist, but somebody who prevented the people from coming into their own. So rather than arousing the millions into political action, which is how Lenin looked upon Gandhi, the subaltern school says that the Gandhiji actually pushed back the people into passivity. God knows how being 10,000 miles away from the people enables people to, work up such theories out of their imagination. This brings me, I just wanted to say this, that this denying of legitimacy to our own anti-imperialist struggle is one reason why today nationalism has been hijacked by the right wing, by those who had nothing to do with nationalism. Because the secular forces are themselves abandoning nationalism, handing it over to them. I'll come to this theme again. This occurs again because a very Eurocentric, fundamentally Eurocentric view of looking at nationalism. What nationalism meant in Europe is totally different from what nationalism meant in India. How did nationalism emerge in Europe? As all of you are, forgive me if I say something that is so very well known to you, but sometimes it is useful to remind ourselves of simple truths. We all know that nation and nationalism are modern phenomenon. They did not, as our current leaders say, we were not a nation 8,000 years ago. We earlier had empires. The whole world had empires, not nations. Europe, the whole of Europe was divided into several empires: the Roman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And out of these empires emerged the nation states with the rise of capitalism. And how did these nation states in Europe emerge? All of them emerged as homogeneous units. One language, one religion. Catholic France, not even Christian, Catholic France. Protestant England. Unification of Germany, on what basis? Unification of Italy, on what basis? Language. France was a multilingual country, and the French Revolution sort of flattened it out. One language, one religion. So that was the vision, European vision of nationalism, number one. Number two, nationalism in Europe emerged, and as every child knows, the rise of capitalism was accompanied simultaneously with the rise of colonialism. Each state which became capitalist almost from its early days also became a colonial power. From the 15th, 16th century onwards, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Germany, France, England, Japan, USA, everybody had colonies, right? So their nationalism has two characteristics, at least two characteristics. One, it is homogeneous. It homogenizes what the postmodernists say nationalism does. That is, it suppresses difference. And two, it is aggrandizing. At its birth of those nation states is the suppression of other people. What was Indian nationalism? It was the exact opposite. It was a unique experiment in world history. And you as Indians, we as Indians should be proud of it, proud of this kind of achievement, rather than some imaginary achievement like the Bengal governor says that Arjuna had a nuclear tipped arrow. Let's not be proud of this completely ridiculous imagination. Let's be proud of what we were, that there was in the 19th century an imagination of a nation which was completely unique in the world, diversity, which will not try to create one language, one religion. This notion of Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan was not our national. It was the slogan of those who wanted to divide India, not unite India. The slogan of those who want to divide India. So our nationalism was, on the one hand, something which celebrated diversity. Being a great Odia writer, or being a great Assamese poet, or being a great Telugu thinker like Viresi Lingam did not make them anti-national. They also were the greatest of the nationalists. They were complementary phenomenon. This was a great achievement. India could not have become a nation otherwise if it did not celebrate diversity. The British in the 19th century used to describe India, a phrase that Churchill made very popular, as India cannot be a nation. It's a geographical expression. How can you be a nation with so many languages, so many religions, this, that, and the other? So the genius of our people was to imagine a nation which would be different from that of Europe. Secondly, our nationalism was not hegemonic. It was not something that will oppress other people. Ours was a liberating nationalism, liberating from imperialism. So it was the exact opposite of the European version. It is the European version which the Hindutva forces have borrowed today. The European version, the logical conclusion of which was Hitler and Mussolini. Unless the European version, 19th century version, was struggled against by democratic forces, which happened in large parts of Europe. That is why not everywhere did you get a Hitler and Mussolini. But that was the logical end. It is that logical end now which is being imposed on India and calling it Indian nationalism. Now, if you don't read the social sciences, if you don't read your history, you will begin to believe this complete lie. That is not our nationalism. Our nationalism was a liberating, humane. It is not an alpha male violence nationalism. It is a nationalism which was humane, which was inclusive, which drew its strength from its diversity. what has happened with the resurgence of colonialism is the resurgence of their junior partner, communalism, also in India. In fact, as I've been saying now for quite some time, the longest lasting legacy of colonialism is that it leaves behind a divided people. That it left behind a destroyed economy, in Tagore's word, a country which when the British leave, it will be just mud and filth. That they left us in mud and filth, in poverty. 3 million people died 4 years before independence of famine. The average life expectancy at independence was less than 30. That is, the people used to die when they were in their 20s, average, which means the poor probably died when they were 3, 4, 5, 6. That is what we inherited. But we were able to get out of most of that. The political degradation, the economic degradation. We are still very poor, but we are nothing like what it was in, do not for a moment believe that nothing happened for the last 70 years till Modi ji came, and new things began to happen. The average life expectancy is way beyond 60 now. It was in the 20s in 1950. All right. So things have changed. But one thing we have not been able to undo is that colonialism left us in a divided people. A people where for centuries multiple religions could coexist. Islam came to India when the Prophet was still alive. Christianity also came to India shortly after its birth. And they survived in this country. What Amartya Sen calls the dialogical tradition, the argumentative Indian, where you could live with difference, which is the heart of democracy. That was there. But what colonialism does is to aggravate differences, solidify them, crystallize them, politicize them. And we are today the victims. 70 years after colonialism has gone, its chief contribution is that we have been left a divided people. So that our effort at becoming a nation, which they tried to break by bringing colonialism, that effort of their communal effort is now what has taken center stage in India. This communal effort in the social sciences is manifested in many ways. What is happening to the social sciences? You are now finding that mythology is replacing history. Beginning from school textbooks to the tallest of the political leaders in public platforms talking of mythology as historical fact. You've heard our tallest leaders say, or haven't you, that India had a great scientific tradition, so great that we could do plastic surgery in ancient India, in pre-ancient India. And the proof is, how did otherwise Ganesha get an elephant head? It's being said seriously by your tallest political leader. So it's completely destructive of the brain, of any intellect, of any science. All societies have mythologies. Somewhere you have the unicorn, somewhere you have the mermaid, a fish and a woman together. Does that mean that they were doing plastic surgery to put a fish and a woman together? We look like idiots in the world when we make claims like this. Convert our mythology into history. Now that is one thing that is happening across the board. This statement was made in the Indian Science Congress, which is always inaugurated by the Prime Minister. Papers being read on this. Fly in ancient India. Otherwise, what was this Pushpak Viman or whatever, So, Hanuman is flying and Arjun is using nuclear-tipped arrows. So this is at a ridiculous level, but mind you, it is very destructive of any intellect and of any social science. So this is on the one hand. Privileging of faith over facts. because I believe that so and so was born in this particular spot 40,000 years ago, or 30,000 or 10,000 years ago, that is a fact. And if you question that fact, you said, but that is my faith, that is my belief, so you have to believe. Now, history cannot be done, or science cannot be done. The physical sciences cannot be done on this basis of it being my faith. My faith is that rishis and munis were born in a matka. So does that become a fact? That's your faith. Can that be a fact? Did Europe accept that as a fact? Did science not grow? Did biology not grow despite such a belief, a notion? Is there no way of handling traditional, ancient, your early ancestors' beliefs as beliefs and science and facts as facts to be able to differentiate the two? So this is one thing that is happening on a big scale. The other is a deliberate poisoning of the texts, the historical texts, removal of facts. For example, in Rajasthan, they produced a textbook on modern India, on the national movement, and there is no Jawaharlal Nehru in it. He does not exist. The man who spent about 8 years in jail, led the country for 17 years after independence, does not exist. Another textbook produced had no mention on contemporary India, had no mention of Mahatma Gandhi's murder. And when there are a lot of opposition emerged in various parts of the country, one line was added that Gandhi was murdered by Nathuram Godse. Nothing about who's Nathuram Godse. What forces did he represent? What was his link with the RSS? Why did he murder Gandhiji, the father of the nation? And that too at its very birth. Question is not asked. So you distort history. We wrote a book called RSS School Texts and the Murder of Mahatma Gandhi, in which we cited RSS school textbooks at the school level, 9-year-old, class 4, class 5, where they are taught about Islam, for example. Islam, wherever it goes with the sword in one hand, Quran in the other. It destroys temples, it humiliates mothers and sisters, it burns libraries, and this, that, and the other. Now, who are the people who are saying this? Who destroyed the mosque, the Babri Masjid? Who humiliated mothers and sisters? Who burnt the Bhandarkar, who demolished the Bhandarkar library in Pune? But the evil is this Muslim. So that a young child, when he grows up, he thinks that if he eliminates one Muslim, he has done a great nationalist act. Now you understand where the lynch mobs come from. How is it that it is one of us young people who go about in the name of Ram killing? You require to create a mindset to produce this kind of murderous behavior. This is what was done in Germany. It took centuries of prejudice against the Jews. Remember, Shakespeare writing in the 16th century, he's talking of the bloodthirsty Jew. So it takes a long time to create this notion where you can sit back and listen to Bach, where millions of Jews are being murdered. Right? Which is what we are witnessing today. We are sitting back and watching open lynching in a country which was once proud of being diverse, of a democratic nation. This is what happens when you do damage to yours. My time is running out. Now let me then quickly in another Professor Pradhan, how much time can I take more? Will somebody guide me? How much more time I can take?
Sir, you can continue.
Okay. All right. I will give you another shocking example of how the colonial mindset, what I call the Eurocentric mindset, the communal mindset, has remained not only in or the communalist, but even among others. Just as I picked on Eric Hobsbawm, a person I admire, continue to admire as a great scholar, I'll pick on another scholar who I admire, Perry Anderson. For 17 or 18 years, the editor of the New Left Review, a globally renowned Marxist. His writings are referred to, including by us, for the teaching of history and of the past by universities all over the world, particularly his writings on Marxism and on European history. But then Perry Anderson suddenly decides that he wants to write on India. And in 1912, he writes 3 articles on India in the London Review of Books. Very rubbishes are Indian. He makes fun of Nehru and Gandhi, calls them upper caste leaders. Says Nehru didn't even know English. Otherwise, how could he give a speech like, when the world sleeps, India shall awake? On his 50, that when India sleeps, the United States is awake. I mean, some ridiculous thing like that. And this is, as I said, a tall scholar like that, just making fun of our national movement. But what I'm going to point out to you, I wrote this in the EPW, because every word I say, historians give a footnote, no? So I can't verbally give footnotes. So every word I say, I publish. So that to convince you that I stand up for it. These are not imagination, it's not lies. Everything that I have said about Tirthankar Roy, I have published each word. Everything that I am saying about Perry Anderson, I have published. Now, what does Perry Anderson do? Let me just give you 2 or 3 instances and you will see. And by the way, the 3 articles that he wrote was republished in India by Indian publisher, a left Indian publisher called the 3 Essays Collective, as the Indian ideology. The reference was Marx wrote the German ideology. So here is Perry Anderson writing the Indian ideology. Now, what does he say in the book? I'll give you 3-4 examples. I don't have time to give you the full thing, but to do justice to the erudite audience that I have, I must give you examples from the best scholars in the discipline. So what does he say? He says that the Indian National Congress was a caste Hindu party. It was not a party. I'm talking of the National Movement days, not now. Please don't confuse current Congress with the National Movement Congress. During the National Movement, everybody was in the Congress, from Namudripad to Gandhiji. It was a platform. It was not a political party. So he says the Indian National Congress was a caste Hindu party. Repeating the words of Lord Dufferin, the conservative viceroy, the Indian National Congress represents the microscopic minority. It doesn't represent the Indian people. This was the British argument, that the Congress, who's trying to speak for the Indian people, they said, you are not speaking for the Indian people. You are speaking for only upper castes. An idea which was picked up by the Cambridge School of History, and major scholars for decades wrote this, that is why it's called a school, that the Congress was only a party of upper castes fighting among themselves, Brahmins and this Brahmin and that Brahmin, fighting for their interest, asking for crumbs from the colonial state. This is how they like to describe the Congress, and Perry Anderson is repeating this. So they see how destructive of whatever good you produce it is. The way to colonize a people is to kill whatever good is in them, whatever beauty, whatever courage, whatever sacrifice they have made, you make fun of it. Ye kya hai? Ye to, upper caste hai. You destroy a person like Gandhiji, which even Einstein said that for generations people will wonder that how could such a man walk on this earth? You ridicule him by saying he's an upper caste fellow. And then this is number 1. Number 2, he says, universal franchise, that is democracy, which the Congress wanted, was unsuitable to India. This is exactly the British argument, that democracy is unsuitable to India. And the reason why Perry Anderson says it is unsuitable to India is that if democracy came to India, then the majority will rule. This was the Muslim League argument. And then Anderson says that the British did a very good thing by giving separate electorate to the Muslims. The thing which divided India down the middle, the notion of a separate electorate. Do you know what it means? It means that a Muslim can only vote for a Muslim, the candidate will be a Muslim, the voters will be Muslim. Because the idea is that a Hindu can never represent a Muslim and a Muslim can never represent a Hindu. So the two-nation theory is born in the idea of separate electorate. This is not reservation of seats, which is a different thing. You reserve a seat for a Dalit or a Muslim, all it means is that everybody will have to vote for him. The Muslim or the Dalit candidate will have to go to everybody. It doesn't split the nation. Separate electorate does. That's why Gandhiji was willing to give up his life for it. Which he ridicules. Which he ridicules. So this is number 3. Number 4. He says, what led to the partition of the country? If you've been hearing our current leaders, increasingly what they've been saying is what led to the partition of the country was the Congress. What led to the partition is not Muslim League, it is not RSS, it is not those who are trying to divide the country on the basis of religion, it is not even the colonial state who engineered the whole show. So look at this complete inversion of history by Perry Anderson. So he says it is the Congress which did it. Why? Because they were so in such a hurry to come to power. And not only did they were responsible for partition, they were also responsible for it being so cruel. So all Congress. I cannot even believe that somebody can write this and we can get away with it. What have we done to ourselves that we allow to be thrown at us and we just keep quiet? A counter view of this period, I don't have time to give you, but just to finish this argument, in my critique of Perry Anderson, I had also written that try and apply it to your own country. Why don't you have separate electorate in England, where the Asians, the blacks, the Catholics, who are a minority, should be given separate electorate? No. In Britain, it will not be done. Why? Because they are superior people. They can think in terms of class, they can think in terms of nation. We, the barbarians, the child people, can only think in terms of caste and religion, primordial identities. Now, this is the heart of Eurocentrism, that us and they, categories of mobilization, and they, the barbarians, have primitive categories of mobilization. Now, this is so powerful a notion that, that modern values have come from the West. The notion, they refuse to understand that there are alternate routes to modernity. The notion that the Enlightenment came to the West first and then spread to the rest of the world. Almost every child you speak to believes this. But what rubbish! The German historian Dietmar Rothermund wrote an article which was brilliant. What he did was he compared Akbar, as you know, he was ruling in the 16th century, with Philip II, who also ruled for about the same period as Akbar, a long period, in Spain. And reason, he's talking of rationality, he's talking of debate, he's organizing debate amongst multiple religions in his court. There is an example in the 16th century where a state is actually organizing discussion on religion rather than sticking to one religion. He says, while all this is happening in India, which are the Enlightenment values in 16th century, in Spain, you have the Spanish inquests, that is large-scale murders in the name of factions of religion. And yet, we buy the story that enlightenment comes in Europe first, and then it comes to us. Now, this is Eurocentrism. I'll end today, since Professor Pradhan had mentioned science, with a comment on the sciences. This notion that sciences are something very different. where no Eurocentrism can exist, is also wrong. What has happened in the third world countries is the privileging of the sciences over the social sciences. It was understandable because the only way third world countries could get out of their underdevelopment was to enter the area, the scientific area, which was left barren completely, deliberately so, by the colonial rulers. So you had to enter. That is why Nehru's enormous effort from the 50s itself to create all the scientific establishments that you are aware of. You know, the IITs and the Bhabha Atomic Research Center and the National Physical Laboratory, National Chemical Laboratory, etc., etc. Huge emphasis on the sciences because it was zero. But it is understandable. But what it has led to is two things. This privileging of the sciences over the social sciences has gone to such an extent that increasingly you are finding that elite schools in India have stopped teaching. They don't even, I know of several top schools in Delhi which don't even offer history as an option. Not necessary. Commerce, engineering, MBA, and that's it. The social sciences are neglected. Now this is very, very dangerous. What has the privileging of the sciences led to? On the one hand, it is true that we produced in a very short period, by the 1970s itself, a huge manpower, which was scientifically trained manpower. By the 80s, we are talking of being the third largest scientific manpower in the world. But what use was it to us? The engineering graduates and the medical graduates that were produced in this poor country out of the sweat and blood of the poor, when they began to come out in the mid 60s and 70s, entire batches sat the exams to run away to England or the USA. So that in the US, 1 out of 3 doctors is Indian. And in India, there are no doctors in entire districts. So they all went. That they went is one matter. Science comes. I tell this story almost in every lecture that I give. I once accidentally spent some time with a professor from an IIT, I will not mention which one, and a very eminent professor. And we met accidentally, introduced to start chatting, so we started chatting. And after a while, he says, Professor Mukherjee, I'm delighted today. So I thought it has been made by a student or some invention has been made. He said, Professor Mukherjee, my whole class has gone to USA. I almost fainted. What a sick society we have produced. Where a teacher thinks that the greatest achievement he has off his entire class to another country. What intelligentsia are we producing? And that is when I want to spend 5 minutes with you. That if you had a training in the social sciences, this is how you will go. First, you will say, what is colonialism? You know, we have been for decades and decades and decades taught colonialism is loot of wealth. Bharat ek सोने की चिड़िया थी, लूट लिया उसको, or it's export of raw materials and import of manufactured goods. Just two ideas. From class 5 till the MA entrance exam that we have checked, MPhil entrance exam we have checked in JNU for years. Essentially these two ideas. But colonialism is not that. Colonialism is the transfer. You know, for the bulk of the British colonial period, we did not export raw materials and import manufactured goods. The first 50 years, we exported manufactures. Anyway, but the point I'm making is colonialism is the taking away by the ruling power of whatever happens to be the key factor of production at that historical time. Like in the pre-industrialized world, let's take the 16th century or the 17th century, what is the most important factor of production? What makes a country rich? Obviously, land and labor, because just land is not good enough. You need labor. And what is colonialism in that period? It is grabbing other people's land entire continents of it and calling it discovery. They're discovering civilizations which are 5,000 years old. Discovery of India. The very term is Eurocentric. You are discovering. As Professor Dussel had pointed out, they were discovering the world with Chinese maps. So, colonialism was at that time taking away other people's land, putting their people into forced labor, into such hard labor that they would die. In Mexico, 95% of the mines. But you need to work the mines, so you need more labor, so you bring them from Africa. So slavery, right? So this is what you see in the pre-industrial phase. Once industrialization happens, the key factor of production is capital. So that's when you see the transfer of capital, what we now call tribute or drain, which Tirthankar Roy says did not exist. So the drain of wealth occurs. So much so that at the peak of British industrialization, 85% of what they invested in their economy to be the first industrialized country came from the colonies as loot. Today, what is the key factor of production? Any child will tell you. We are a post-industrial society. The key factor of production today is knowledge. It's the information revolution. We are a knowledge society. And what are you witnessing for the last half a century? You're witnessing this knowledge being thrown out. It's being taken away. I'll give you one statistic. The United States of America produced this statistic. It is not mine. I am not imagining it. In the 1960s, only 14% scientific subjects, which are breakthrough areas, were by non-Americans. Today, this is the figures of 2012 or 13. Today, there are 40%. 2 out of 5 American PhDs in key areas which lead to development are by non-Americans. Look at the heads of institutions, scientific institutions in the USA. So many of them are Indian. All right. So the breakthrough are by now the outsiders. Now, what is the other flip side? Flip side is 95% of Indians who go to the United States to do their PhDs in the sciences. I'm not even talking about the social sciences. In the sciences, in maths, in physics, in engineering, 95% in medicine, they stay there. So this whole trickle-down theory, just forget about it. So while India hands it over, the USA rakes it in. And while handing over our resources, the key factor of production, we pat ourselves in the back. Our teachers say, Shabash, beta, America chale jao. This is no slavery. This is not even forced immigration that Amitav Ghosh writes about. This is not your migrant labor from UP and Bihar. Indentured laborers, almost forced out of the country. These are people voluntarily going out. And your state fighting with the United States government, ki bhai, H1 visa, jaldi se do, allow our people to go in. That is, you're fighting over each other to go and colonize your own country. That is when you do not know the social sciences. Rather than create a structure where your scientists want to contribute to your own society, you try to create a structure where the elite of your country, to even get into an IIT, you have to be half a genius, as you know what kind of marks you have to get. And then 99% of the IIT toppers sit in the United States. So what is the net contribution to your country? Zero. 2 top Indian scientists did a paper. And I'll end with this. One of them was George Sudarshan. You may have all heard of him, great physicist. And he set up the Mathematics Center in Chennai, etc., etc. They wrote a paper studying the Indian scientists in the USA. And they came to the following conclusion, that Indian scientists quickly get their PhDs, they work their backsides, they work very hard, and they are among the first to get their PhDs. They even get their postdocs very quickly because they're such hardworking people. They're willing to be the last author even when they're the first author, etc., etc. And they even managed to get tenure and become professors. And then after that, they said, when it comes to breakthroughs, you hang on to one Har Govind Khurana. When it comes to Nobel Prizes, out of this billion people, you take the cream and you keep them all there for half a century, and how many breakthroughs? Nothing. And he says the reason is, he says, they say that the Indian scientist is like a member of an orchestra in the USA, where the conductor of the orchestra is the American science establishment. The Indian scientist is never the conductor of the orchestra. What needs to be done? And they came to the conclusion that if you were working in an area which would make a critical difference to your society, if you were to discover a vaccine or a cure for malaria or for cholera, which has killed half your family, it produces one kind of adrenaline. Rather than, as a friend of mine who was a topper in school, topper in college, topper in IIT, and is the vice president of a company in USA, and I interviewed him. This is my favorite topic. And I said, what do you do? He said, I'm at the moment, for the last few months, researching on a earphone, which you can stick inside your ear and keep it there for 7-8 hours, and it will not hurt your ear. I said, wow, what an earth-shattering thing you're doing to make American ears comfortable so that they can have a thing stuck inside your ear for 6 hours. Your your hair must be standing on end. That is why it is said that even science is not universal. It is when you ask your own questions. The biggest breakthroughs by Indian scientists have been made in India. The boson theory, Satyendra Bose, where was he working? Dhaka. Jagdish Chandra Bose, where was he working? I mean, I can give you dozens of examples. It is not necessary. This notion that science is universal and I will go and work where everything, is very, very good, and therefore I'll make breakthroughs. It does not happen that way. Even science is not universal. And because the scientist is not trained in, which are not trained in social science, end up doing what they're doing, the most regressive forces in the country. Your Hindutva forces look at what the American Indian scientists abroad are funding. The NRIs. They're mostly funding the divisive forces, whether they be among the Sikhs or the Muslims or the Hindus. So the social sciences, the abandoning of the social sciences is extremely dangerous. I'll end with just one word, which is to say that we need the social sciences to recover our nationalism. To recover, as the young lady who introduced me, Payal, said very correctly, to recover what was the idea of India, what was the dream of our Indian national leaders. The idea of the Indian nation, a secular, a democratic, a inclusive, a pro-poor, a humane nationalism. That idea of the nation has to be recovered from those who actually stand for the opposite, who are now masquerading as nationalism. And that role can only be provided by the intelligentsia. It's people like you and me who are teachers and students who have to now recover your own nationalism, false nationalism, which is, instead of making our nation, is dividing and destroying our nation. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, sir, for your excellent deliberations. We were totally mesmerized by your lecture. Thanks a lot again for making your lecture a rich source of knowledge for all of us.
Yes, sir. As you said, that today's intelligentsia is not linked to any movement. And perhaps problem lies there. There is a need for that. In order to develop the Indian form of nationalism, in spite of blindly accepting European form of nationalism, which is actually more dangerous than cancer even. Many doubts of us have been cleared and many yet to be done. And as the time passes, the questions in the chat box increases. So as there are lots more questions in the chat box, I would like to invite Mr. Shubham Das to please initiate the open discussion forum. Sir, he will be reading questions for you.
Okay.
Okay, over to Shubham, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. So we have a couple of questions in the chat box. One question is from Professor Kanchan K. Malik from Hyderabad Central University. She asked, excellent critique of the notion of nation and how it is being appropriated by people to interpret it according to their convenience. However, her question is on another aspect. In social sciences, the qualitative approach to research is criticized on the basis that it is anecdotal and not generalizable. Your response to it, sir?
It's a very good question. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Statistics, a quantitative approach, the famous stories. The only historian, I think, who ever got a Nobel used to do this American slave with in order to keep him working. And, it came into some, I forget the figure, some billion lashes had to be, done to keep the American slave functioning. Now, what is the conclusion you draw from it? If the conclusion you draw from that is that slavery was very oppressive, very bad, but it had some advantage. The advantage being that the whip industry came up. Data by itself means nothing. In fact, if you look at Indian studies in economic history, the best of the economic historians, people like Daniel Thorner, Wolf Ledzinski, etc., they have repeatedly said that when they were studying land reforms in India, and they were doing this poverty, measurement of poverty, till we have now much better ways of measurement of poverty. Even now there are grave problems in measurements of poverty. So they said that the much better thing to do, or equally important thing to do, was to do a qualitative visit to the poor and ask afternoon what they ate in the evening, to see what they're wearing, and compare with your last visit 10 years ago. Even today, Nicholas Stern, for example, does this study of a village in UP, which has been done from the 1950s till today. I think the 6th or 7th round of study has been done just recently, last year or so. And all that they're doing is going and visiting and staying in that village and seeing what is the change over time, which means nothing. Is that, there are, according to the statistics, everybody is richer, the poor have become much better off, etc. But when you go to the ground level, you may find exactly the opposite result. So qualitative data, and therefore that's why I was critiquing the subaltern. You cannot speak. It is you cannot begin to talk about India if you haven't even traveled India, if you don't even know your people. You cannot talk of secularism if you have not even tasted difference. So it is necessary a link, a direct link, which has to be qualitative. It cannot be sitting in your home and looking at the figures on a table and figuring out history. That is not. It can never be done like that. But figures are important, but they cannot be decisive.
Thank you, sir. There is another question asked by Dr. Vikram Jena. Why epistemological violence occurs quite frequently in social sciences? Why the Dongrias have to appeal to the court and get their rights recognized after 70 years of legal battle, whereas there is no justice delivered in Kalinganagar? What the subaltern historian went in those moments, particularly not writing a single academic writing, not even visited this field, how can we mapping social sciences research through decolonizing methodology? Over to you, sir.
It is, thank you, Bikram. It is very true. We are very distressed that, leave alone the academic, and certainly the academic, I'll come back to it, but even the journalist. If a poor man dies, it's not news. If a poor person gets raped, it's not news. If what we witnessed after the pandemic, The thousands and thousands of people, little children being dragged on the road, on shoulders of people, and in the heat of 40 degrees, 42 degrees centigrade, dying on the roadside, that it should not be the primary concern of every sociologist, every political scientist, everybody who does any study, leave alone the journalist, is suggestive of what has become of us. I think it is suggestive of what Payal you appreciated, the fact that we are not linked to any attempt to make social change. And how can we? When the best of us, as I said, dream and plan and plot how to send our children abroad, how to run away. So many of my colleagues have been telling me, "Arey Aditya, you are speaking very dangerously. Have you made enough arrangement to live abroad, to run away?" If people try to think like that, then where is social change going to occur from? If your people's suffering do not matter to you, if what you're describing, what is happening in the tribal areas, it's not that nobody is taking it up. People did. But those people are being put in jail, and what are we doing about it? The best of the scholars did. Sudha Bhardwaj, as you know, was the daughter of Krishna Bhardwaj, our colleague in JNU, one of the most famous economists in the world in her area in political economy. And her daughter is Sudha. Sudha was a mathematician. She taught in IIT. And then she did law because she wanted to fight for the rights of the people in the tribal areas. And that's all she did. And they've put her in jail, and she's already in jail for 2 years. And what have we done? What have we done when an entire state has been put in prison? Kashmir. Our liberty, we forget that unless we protect somebody else's liberty, your liberty is also going to go one day. If you want your own liberty, start fighting for the other person's liberty. Today it is Kashmir, tomorrow it can be Bengal, day after tomorrow it can be Odisha. And then there will be nobody to fight. So rather than making fun of our liberation struggle, let us learn from our liberation struggle. What did Gandhiji say? Antodaya. Look at the poorest. When you have a doubt in your mind, his famous talisman, when you have a doubt in your mind what path you should choose, think of the poorest face you have ever seen, poorest person you have ever met, and think, will my next step help him in any way? And take your step in that direction. That is turning your face towards the poor. But today I'm saying, leave alone turning your face towards the poor, at least turn your face towards your country. Rather than keeping your gaze fixed on how you can migrate and run away. So you're absolutely right. It is the job of the academic. They are the people who are creating the next generation. What are you and I a product of? We are a product of the 19th century intelligentsia. We, unlike the subalterns, actually went and talked to the poor. We traveled all over the country. We started from the northernmost district of Kerala called Kasargod and went district by district till Cape Comorin and came right up to Odisha along the coast, all over the country for over 2 years. Talking to the poorest, talking to the Dalit woman. You can't get worse than that. And asking them that how is it, these were the old people who participated in some movement or the other. National movement, communist movement, socialist movement, working class movement, peasant movement. So we would ask them that how is it that, in those days, in the 1930s and some even in the 20s, we started this in 1980. So many people were still alive. How is it that you were able to come out and work in the fields? Who encouraged you? Believe you me, 99% of the people said, my school teacher or my mother, not their father. They said, beta, desh ke liye kuch karo. We are a product of the school teachers of those days, the intelligentsia of those days. Ashwini Kumar Dutt had set up a school in Barisal, which still exists, and produced whole range of nationalists in Bengal. And I'm sure there are examples all over the country of this kind. So The intelligentsia of the 19th century created an India we were so proud of. But today we have an intelligentsia which has no agenda. Not only does it not have a spine anymore, but it doesn't even have an agenda beyond itself, beyond their little career or the next promotion. It's a great tragedy for a country of our genius and of our capacity that our intelligentsia should not perform any role at all, however little. We don't all have to become revolutionaries, but at least we can talk. As I am talking to you, you can talk to somebody else. We can convince people in our family. We can convince 5 other people. If we were to at least begin a task of having an agenda beyond ourselves.
Thank you, sir. There is another question asked by SK Imran. Does the social science research is not given importance in India by the mythological leaders because their shop might be closed? For that, they are showing the false and illogical thing in such a way that the false are truth and restrict them to research like that in Hindu society now also only Brahmins are allowed to read the sacred scriptures. So what is the problem with the mindset of the people who believes in them? And are these mythological leaders can be called as divisor who were dividing the nations?
I will rephrase what you are saying. It's a good question. What you are saying is true, that no authoritarian society wants its people to be of critical thinking. That is why any fascist state, the first attack it does is on the university system. When Hitler came to power, the first thing they did was attack Frankfurt University, which was at that time the top university in Germany. And the history of what happened to Frankfurt University has been written by Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker is this great management guru. You know, he had to run away from Frankfurt to the USA at that time. He's one of those people who was almost murdered in Frankfurt. So they destroyed step by step. And the steps they took in Frankfurt is exactly the steps they're taking today in JNU. Destroy the university. Put the best students of ours who are asking the right questions in jail, or file sedition cases against them. Make it difficult for, JNU was maligned so badly in 2016-17 that auto-diverse and saying that JNU produces terrorists and anti-nationalists, I'm supposed to be producing terrorists and anti-nationalists, that auto rickshaw drivers were refusing to bring passengers to JNU saying that we don't go to Pakistan. So you malign the intellectual, you malign and you try to subordinate the intellectual. That is the thing. If they do not listen, then kill them. After all, Gauri Lankesh was shot. So was Kulburgi, the former vice-chancellor. So was the Volker. These are people who were killed. The others, you try to scare. But then, if the numbers are large, how many can you kill? How many can you scare? That is why everybody needs to speak up. And these days, it's not as difficult to speak up as it was in Tilak's time. And even Tilak spoke up, went to jail for it. In our time, speaking up means just putting a Facebook post. And, it's not such a difficult job to just say that, look, I don't agree. And this young girl, who's a daughter of an army officer, said that I'm against war. And look how she was trolled, she was chased and this, that, and the other. She says, I don't want war with Pakistan. So why can't people exercise their right? If people stop exercising their right to speak, that right itself disappears. Again, I don't want to bore you with this because I've said it so often. I often repeat this Holocaust poem by Martin Niemöller. You may have all heard about it. Martin Niemöller was a priest in Germany. And he thought that, he will do a little bit of a deal with Hitler so that his little community of Christians would be spared. And then he got wise and he went, stopped colluding. So he was arrested, put in a concentration camp. And he was to be eliminated. And days before his turn came, the war ended and he got released. So he avoided being burnt alive by the skin of his teeth. After coming out, there was the Stuttgart Declaration, where people started questioning that what is it that the German people did which enabled Hitler to come to power? Or rather, what is it that they did not do? What was the role of the church? Did it resist or not resist? And that is when this little poem that he wrote became globally famous. It is used all over the world now, wherever there is resistance. And the poem goes like this. It says, first they came for me. And I did not, no, sorry. First they came for the Jews. They meaning who? These stormtroopers of Hitler, these gangs, these mob lynchers. They came for the Jews. And I did not speak up because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists. Again, I did not speak up because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists. And I did not speak up because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade union worker. And I did not speak up because I was not a trade union worker. And then when they came for me, there was nobody left to speak up. So let us not reach that situation that every one of us lose our freedom. When we see somebody else lose their freedom, and we are seeing every day somebody or the other lose their freedom. 80-year-olds, 90-year-olds, Stan Swami gives his whole life working for the underprivileged, the tribals. Entire life. A priest from Kerala coming up and working in the Northeast. And he's in prison. And if we don't speak up, then the time when our turn will come is not very far.
Thank you, sir. Rudra has thus asked, young scholars are discouraged to write frankly about how things are on the ground. What is your opinion on it, sir?
Discouraged by whom? If it is discouraged in the family, then speak up in the family. If it is discouraged in your classroom, then show a little courage and speak up. Find some other people who will agree with you. If, as I said, you have to resist in some form or another. You don't have to be a revolutionary. But to say that you cannot resist means that you have no individuality, you have no self. You're a doormat that you cannot resist in any way. Not even in a small way. Not even showing unhappiness. Not even voting by your feet by not talking or going and visiting that person who talks like that. Something, I'm sure there can be something that everybody can do.
Thank you, sir. There is the last question is from my side, that third world countries like India are inviting European developed countries to outsource their polluting industries to India to extract our natural resources to achieve overnight development, that what our government thinks on the basis of rapid industrialization that no longer benefits our indigenous or tribal people. But sir, my question is to you that do you think unless we decolonize our greed over selling of our natural resources in a cheap rate, soon we are going to face more acute environmental threat in future at the cost of this type of development process? Over to you, sir.
You are absolutely right. You're absolutely right. This is double standards. Manchester, which used to be the industrial center of England, the factories are all now universities. They're colleges. There are no factories in Manchester. The same is happening in Pittsburgh. More Toyota cars are made outside Japan than in Japan. That's why I said this is a post-industrial society. So the polluting industries, the hard industries are being pushed onto the third world. So rather than realizing that and making a jump, this is what Nehru tried to do. He anticipated the knowledge revolution. Otherwise, why in the 1950s would he be promoting nuclear research, tell me? So you anticipate the future. So strengthening ourselves in the area of change is occurring. There we are handing out, as I said, all the knowledge we create. We are now taking from the West, which are the worst elements, the leftovers, which is going to destroy our environment. It is absolutely unacceptable. In any case, any development. And again, we are not even following our constitution. The constitution lays it down very clearly that you cannot start an industry, you cannot do anything unless you have the consent of a substantial number of people of that area. It's constitution. But none of those committees, the tribal committees and the village committees, etc., none of them function. So it is, we don't even have to do, as I said, anything revolutionary. We just need to fight to see that what is already in our constitution, that is the rights of the tribals, which are very well laid out, very well laid out. It's only that we are not fighting for it. And those who are fighting are being penalized, bumped off.
Thank you, sir, for responding all our questions. Now I would like to invite Palman to continue the session.
Thanks a lot again, sir, Mukherjee sir, for answering the questions. And thanks to Subham sir too for initiating the open discussion forum. After this excellent session, and perhaps I should call it as a thrilling session, inspiring session also, as a lot of comments have also came. So we are now headed towards concluding the session. For this, I would like to again invite Mr. Shubham Das to please conclude the session by giving vote of thanks. Shubham sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor and privilege for me to give a formal vote of thanks for this brainstorming session. I'd like to